Welcome to this lecture on sound and hearing. This lecture will be about all the fundamentals of sound, hearing, and waveforms, and we'll do some examples and listen to some audio at the end of this lecture. So what is sound? I think of sound like when you throw a stone in a pond, or if you have two people holding a slinky and you make the waves go back and forth. So in the beginning of the sound, the waves are closer together, or if you move a slinky, the waves are closer together, and as those waves go further apart, further away from the source, the waves get further apart. So we have compression and rarefaction, that's what it's called. So compression increases atmospheric pressure close to the sound source, rarefaction, the area further away from the source where atmospheric pressure is below normal. So as it goes, pressure goes above and below normal, there you see a sine wave. And this is just measuring the atmospheric pressure above and below normal. You'll see some things here, pressure on the y-axis and wavelength on the x-axis, one cycle being a wavelength. And these are measured in terms of time. So this time is related to frequency, which is cycles per second, notated in hertz. So let's talk about some of the waveform characteristics. It's really important to understand the waveforms because this is what we're going to be recording. We'll learn about these terms: amplitude, frequency, velocity, wavelength, phase, and harmonic content. So here you see a sine wave, and here is where sound pressure is 0, and you see the wave going above and below the axis. So if you look at one cycle, it shows here on this graph one cycle, and you can see the amplitude of the waveform. If you want peak to peak amplitude, it's all the way from the bottom to the top, so that's called peak to peak amplitude, and the x-axis is time. You can see here relative voltage, which also relates to volume. So as these waves get higher, the sound gets louder. Also, the frequency, the number of cycles per second, as it gets slower, these waveforms get longer and the sound gets lower. As it gets faster, the pitch gets higher. So let's talk about frequency. Frequency is measured in hertz, named after a German physicist, Heinrich Rudolf Hertz, and one cycle, here you can see the wavelength of one cycle is shown there, and again the amplitude or power or volume is shown on the y-axis. So cycles per second, that's important to know. The velocity, or the speed at which sound travels, varies depending on how you're listening to it. If you're listening to the velocity in air, which is most of the time, the velocity is 130 feet per second. And of course it changes in water. You can look up the velocity in water, and you'll see that's when you calculate that, you'll see why the wavelengths get longer and that you can hear sound from farther distances away in water. To calculate the wavelength, it's the velocity over the frequency. So as the velocity increases, the wavelength will increase as well. And the period is known as the time it takes to complete one cycle, or wavelength. So sound can be reflected and also can bounce back and cancel each other. This is a picture of a wall. If you played a sound and it hit the wall and there was a wall next to it, it would basically crash into each other and some of the sound would cancel out. Or if you had sound coming at an angle, it would come off at a different angle. That's called reflection. You have to be careful when you're recording sound using if you have flat walls or small rooms and in the angles and corners, and that's why sound treatment exists. So a lot of times you'll see sound panels on walls or different things directing the sound in different directions. Here's some examples of reflecting and directing sound. Here's a concave surface where as the sound hits it, the sound moves away from the source, and a convex surface where as the sound hits the convex surface, it goes towards the source. If you look around next time you're in a theater, you'll see different surfaces that redirect the sound toward the audience, for example. And I wanted to put this here, a microphone shield. They cost about $100. If you're recording on your own and you want to take away issues in the room, you put the microphone shield up and it acts as your basically convex surface that directs the sound toward your microphone. It sounds great. So the range of human hearing is 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz, 20 to 100 being the low stuff, 100 to 1,000 being mids, 1,000 to 10,000 higher mids, and then 10,000 and up very high. The range of human hearing is up to 20,000 hertz, but as you get older, you lose a lot of the higher frequencies, especially above 15,000 hertz. Here's two popular microphones. They're dynamic microphones, which we'll learn about in a later lesson, but just to show you, as when microphones are designed, they're measured on how they respond to frequencies. So these two microphones, the Shure SM57 and SM58, have a flat response, which is good in all the mid-ranges, and that's what they're designed to do. They're designed to pick up voices, mid-range things, and guitars. Now, a little bit later in this lesson, we're going to hear about phasing, but phase, we saw what phase looks like learning about frequencies, and you can see if phase is, for example, you had two microphones and one was behind the other, you would get sound at one microphone before the other and you'd get a phase shift, which is going to basically cancel out some of the sounds that you're trying to hear or add something different. Here's another phase shift where basically the microphones are switched positions, and you can see you get some cancellation of sounds. And here you have two frequencies that are exact opposite of each other, and they will cancel each other out. And then another situation, if you have two that are exactly the same, they will get louder. So I'll demonstrate that in a few minutes. Here's another picture of two waves that are the same, they get louder. You get a little bit of cancellation as well. Two that are exact opposites, the sound cancels each other out. We're also going to be listening to harmonic content. So if you use a pitch, I'm starting here with 440 hertz, which is a tuning A in an orchestra. Every time you add another 440 hertz, you get a harmonic of that tone. So 440 plus 440 is 880, and you add another 440, it's 1320. Those are the harmonics of the notes. They blend together, and we'll listen to that in a few minutes. Another thing about waves, and this is in all of the software that we'll be using, is the envelope of the waveform. You have an attack, and it can be short, it can be long, a decay, a sustain, and a release. So for example, a cymbal would have a very long envelope because that sound sustains for a long time. Or if you have something like a gong, that's really long. Something short would be like a mallet instrument, or maybe one note on a trumpet or a hit of a snare drum. Those would be shorter envelopes. And we can manipulate the sound when we're editing. We can add a reverberation, we can add delays, so this is really important to understand because these attack, decay, sustain, and release will be things that you can edit in your software. Here's a couple examples of some waveforms of a cymbal with that long sustain or snare where you have the quick attack and then short release. So sound is denoted in decibels after Alexander Graham Bell, and it's always small d, capital B for decibel. It basically represents how loud a sound is heard, and it's expressed in a logarithmic scale. So the difference between 1 and 1,000 is like 1 and 2, because when you're looking at logarithmic scales, you're looking at the log of 10, the log of 100, the log of 1,000. So you can look at the zeros. The log of 10 is 1, the log of 100 is 2, the log of 1,000 is 3. So you can see how a large change in sound pressure is a small difference in the decibel number. And here's what we're talking about between 40 decibels and 140, basically what we hear. Conversation down here, 40, 50, 60, and then pain being around 120, 130, 140 you start actually experiencing hearing loss over time if you're listening at that volume. Normally when we're recording, it's the main thing I want you to know, we're choosing about 83 to 85 hertz. And it's important to record at that level and listen back so that you get consistent mixing. And the ears change the way we hear sound, very low and very loud as well. So those would not be good reference levels. Some equations on how to listen to decibels. We won't be using this in this class, but I wanted to give them here in case you're in a studio and you need to look at decibels in terms of sound pressure, voltage, or power. Each of these have a reference level for sound pressure that goes into that equation as well. So let's talk for a minute about the ear. The ear, the way it works is sound comes in, hits your eardrum or the diaphragm in your ear, goes through the cochlea, and then vibrates the little bones, and then it hits the cilia, these little hairs, and then that transmits through the nerves into your brain. So that 130, 140 decibels, at that level, these hairs get damaged and they kind of just die off. And as they get damaged, they never can recover, and you lose the ability to hear those high frequencies for the rest of your life. So when you're listening to very loud things, it's really important to have good hearing protection. Here's the threshold of hearing, again, 0 to 140. So be careful at these high levels. And then another thing is about fidelity. Now that you know that we can hear between 20 and 20,000 hertz, or that's the range, any equipment you buy should be in that range as well. So if you have a very cheap microphone that's not 20 to 20,000, it's one of these other things, they're better to poor fidelity, and those are things that would be consumer equipment or unprofessional, non-professional. Another thing when you're recording is the signal to noise ratio. Make sure it's very quiet in the background, because as you record, when you increase the volume, you also increase the noise. So the signal to noise ratio needs to be excellent when you're recording. So just make sure that you're in a quiet space and that the noise in the background is as silent as it can be. And finally, here's a shot of some Pro Tools software showing how waveforms look as they're edited. So now let's do a demonstration using some recording software. And there we go. So let's listen to harmonics first. This is a 440 wave. Oh, by the way, when I drag these frequencies in, and you can do that as well because I have them loaded up, you can drag them in on each track, and then on the bottom right, you can zoom way in and see the actual sine waves. So that's what we're doing here. There's also up here the zoom, so you may need to zoom out to see the waveform if you're not seeing the amplitude. If it's cut off, you can use the zoom out button. Okay, so here we're seeing a 440 waveform. I'm going to hit play. I can hit play up here, spacebar, and I have it on autoplay. Options, auto loop playback, so that it plays that over and over. Now we add 440, hear the second harmonic, the third harmonic, fourth, and fifth. Let me turn off that. Oh, I got these on mute. That's why. So those harmonics are just adding 440 to the first wave. So the second harmonic was 880 and so forth. And that's what those sound like. So you can try that on your own system. Now let's try 140 again. 440 hertz. And now we're going to listen to 445 right next to it. So the beating you hear is because your ear can't discern those. They're so close together that you hear beating. And that's actually when you're tuning instruments, if somebody's out of tune right next to you, you can change your instrument to be flatter or sharper until you match the other person in tune. That's how it works. Now let's look at the next one I have is 450. Yes. And with 445, you get the beeping. See 440. So it's 450 slightly higher pitch, so you can hear the beeping gets faster or slower depending on how close you are to the other frequency. Now, let's look at something really interesting. These two waves, they're both 440 hertz, exactly the same, but this one, as this one goes up, this one below it goes down. They're exact opposites of each other. Let's listen to the 0 degree. I have it labeled 440 0 degree. Now let's listen to 180 degree. So they sound exactly the same. Now let's listen to them both together. So what's happening is they're both playing, but they're canceling each other out. And you can see here that they are playing. Again, listen to one, listen to the other, listen to both. They cancel each other out. That's going to be really important when you're doing things like recording a snare drum with two microphones, one on the top and one on the bottom. What I usually do is reverse the phase on the bottom microphone so that they're not out of phase. So those are, that's how that works. And then the last bit here, I have some different frequencies, 1,000 hertz. These are more harmonic tones. So some examples of how waveforms and harmonics works in this lesson. So try this on your own software. Make sure you can zoom in and out, drag files in, drag the tracks in. Again, you can zoom in and out. Always on software, there's zoom in and out functions on these. And there we go. And that would be it. Again, watch all the videos on this and keep reading about sound fundamentals. It'll always explain why you get good or bad sound during a recording.